Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Professor Barry here, week number 3, third installment of these video lectures. We have a lot of ground to cover today, getting into 2 different kind of subject areas, social groups, organization, and then we're moving into very specific topics. After sort of the groups and organization piece, we get into deviance first, and then next week and down the road, we start getting into like social class, race, gender, some very specific topics. So the first part of the course, first couple weeks, is just kind of background, concepts, theories, ideas about sociology, about thinking about culture, structure, individual, all those different kind of things. And now we kind of move into deviance, stratification, race, class, gender, and different topics. Okay, we got a lot of ground to cover today, so let's kind of get started here. I put these key terms here. You don't have to go through them. I just put them there to, to maybe help prepare you for quizzes or, for later on for the exam, but it's not essential. But anyway, I just put them there just so you have them, just some key terms that you may want to kind of identify and kind of know about. All right, so let's kind of start with the topic of conformity. I'll show this short video. I'm at the pause here for a second to get there. Okay, here we go. So this is basically Zimbardo, a social psychologist who's famous for the Stanford prison experiment. Him kind of giving a little bit of background on Ash's study of conformity. And talks about it a little bit. So let's kind of watch this for a little bit.
Sensitivity to differences in line lengths. So I'm going to show you a standard, and then I'm going to show you 3 comparison lines. One is going to be bigger, one is going to be shorter, and one is going to be the same size as the standard. Your job is, tell me which line, A, B, or C, is the same as the standard. Seems like a simple judgment. You always get it right. But now, before you give your answer, there are going to be half dozen to 10 other people like you in the room, and they're going to give their answers first. An amazing thing happens. One after another, they say the line that you see as shorter is the same as the standard. Shorter, 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 shorter. They don't say shorter, they just say B, 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 and so forth. Now it's your turn. You know B is the wrong answer. But what do you say? In this study done by Solomon Asch, a classic study of group conformity, the majority of people gave in on most of the critical trials to say publicly that they agreed with the majority. So this study is one of the first classic studies on the power of a group. As long as there's 3 or more people who agree among themselves that reality is not the way you see it, in many cases, you give in to see the world in their way. Let's look at that study.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the 5th person with the white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3.
But on the 3rd trial, something happens.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Asch found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1. They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me. 1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1.
1.
1.
2.
1. 2. 2.
2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2.
All right, that's kind of the general idea, right? So Ash's study of conformity kind of lays some groundwork for thinking about, just sort of the issue of conformity, right? And thinking about how humans, conform. It's a tendency that we have. It's not a bad tendency. It's actually a pro-social one. But it really kind of brought attention to the public about the degrees to which people conform. And as indicated in this study, that there's different kinds of conformity. One kind of conformity is actually change in behavior, but not in actually personal views. So I know the answer is wrong, but I don't want to rock the boat. I'm just going to go ahead and conform. Or the internalization, actually change one's mind. What I want to kind of stress is that we all conform. Social conformity is a natural human quality. We can create environments that where conformity is well, not only a necessary thing, it's a vital thing within institutions, within social life to conform, but also can get us to some dangerous spots as well, right? The groups that we belong to, things that we have membership into, sometimes we can conform in ways that are harmful to self and others. So it's trying to sort of navigate the space between understanding that conformity is a natural human response, being mindful of how we create institutions to help support conformity that's more pro-social versus conformity that's harmful to self or other. So just different examples of conformity. Pledge of Allegiance, right? Putting your hand over your heart. That's a learned thing, socialization, right? Like learning, remember as a kid, didn't know which way to go. Then after a while, you figure that out and you kind of conform to the group. It's pro-social, right? It's kind of the thing that we do. And it's very difficult, even though, let's say, taking a different example, taking a hat off before the start of a ball game as part of a ritual that is practiced. If you have a hat on, do you take your hat off or not? There's a pressure to conform in part because we desire membership into the group, acceptance within the group. It doesn't mean that we're relinquishing who we are, but it's rather that we're giving value to the group itself. Conformity in terms of line behavior, right? Standing in line. Why not just jump to the front of the line or kind of move? Or there's certain protocols in terms of standing in line that we kind of engage in. A lot of that stuff I think we even do unconsciously. I put these two images here. One of a African-American school where predominantly African-American students, predominantly white students here, just to sort of demonstrate this is a different time period. I was looking for images in the 1950s. You could look at hair, style, dress, fashion, appearance, demeanor, language, and there's a lot of stuff that we could sort of look at in terms of conformity. Even when it seems like it's, a group that's non-conforming, there's conformity within the non-conforming group, right? So there's conformity kind of within that. We could look at some areas that are very problematic, like, looking at sexual assault on college campuses. So within fraternity system, sorority system, within that Greek life, the rates of sexual assault on college campus are significantly higher. Well, that's a lot of social group stuff going on there. It's a lot of conformity to the group that's detrimental to self and other. So institutions have to figure out ways to, understanding how social group and social pressure works and operates, and then create institutional processes that are designed to disrupt that conformity and to give value to more pro-social kind of behavior and things like that. I think of things like, white supremacy, white nationalism. I mean, there's a lot of group conformity within that. The question becomes one of what is the meaning that people are attributing or gaining from belonging and membership into that particular group? The groups themselves may engage in groupthink, right, where they don't allow for dissenting opinions and dissenting ideas. So these rigid boundaries sometimes within groups between the in-group and the out-group can be problematic as well. Even things on the left, you know, the ACAB, all cops are bastards, this sort of extreme sort of position. There's sort of group conformity within that too, right? So group conformity, any social group, there's going to be some operation of group conformity. This book here, I mentioned it, it's an interesting account, Rising Out of Hatred, written by Eli Soslow, and talking about an individual who basically, you know, grew up in a family and a community of white nationalism. Eventually went off to college and became involved with other people that had different backgrounds than himself. So more racially diverse, class diverse, different areas of social life, different ideas, different beliefs, different ideologies. And over a course of time, he basically rose out of hatred. But that took the ability to step outside of group position, to be around other people. And it's being around other people, being aware of what his own beliefs and values kind of were, being able to put them in a context. And, you know, ultimately moved in a different direction. Just an interesting kind of a story, a personal story of a person who kind of grew up in white nationalism and that culture, a group culture, to kind of move into a different perspective. I put this here, I'm not going to watch it right now, but the Tulsa race riots of 1921, powerful kind of example of a community that was organized and segregated along racial lines, an event that happened in 1921. And I think, you know, we can see the riot that happened and the basically backlash against the Black community was powerful. The level of violence that was enacted, you know, that was perpetrated towards the Black community, incredibly powerful. And there's a lot of group stuff that's kind of operating within that. This book is another interesting book. There Goes My Everything. And Jason Sokol spends time interviewing, chatting with people in the South who lived during the time period of the civil rights era development, 1940s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And it's this thing, like it's, you know, we are powerfully shaped by social group. And so to be mindful of that and to be aware, sometimes it's important and valuable to step outside of our own social group experience to be able to understand what our ideas actually are, our beliefs and our convictions, and to be able to see things from different vantage points. Okay, so this question here, which one are the most conforming, least conforming? Are they all the same in terms of degrees of conforming? Who or what is conforming to do, you know, who's conforming to what? What are people conforming to? So I provide this sort of example, okay, somebody in the middle class suburbia, somebody in the struggling class in the inner city who engages in the drug trade. Not meaning to be stereotypical here, but just trying to provide an example of what the pathway someone may choose. A working class individual going to work in a working class life, right? Training for that. I would argue that humans are human. So regardless of our class, regardless of our situation, everyone in these three cases, they're all conforming and they're all equally conforming. Everyone's seeking membership. People are seeking belonging and connection, seeking status, seeking, position within a community. All those different kind of things, fulfilling expectations of family and others. So sometimes we see things such as somebody engaging in behavior that's really shocking. For example, somebody dealing drugs, you know, it's like, okay, we think about them as being non-conforming. And you kind of want to turn that around a little bit and think about, well, isn't that really conforming? Let's think about it in terms of not that that individual is outside the realm of what normal behavior, but rather to see that as a normal response or a response within a different environment. So that's kind of like a focus in thinking about conformity. One thing I want to kind of talk a little bit about too is about, okay, some Zimbardo studied the Stanford prison experiment. If you haven't checked it out, it's worth checking out. You can just, you know, look it up, Stanford prison experiment, and get basically a quick overview. The textbook talks about it as well. But basically, Zimbardo creates a makeshift prison. Everyone who participates is coming from the Stanford University. There's college students. They get randomly selected into being either a guard or a prisoner. And then after a few days, Zimbardo calls off the experiment because it gets out of control, kind of thing. And so there's that discussion. And then there's Milgram's experiment, where there's a teacher and a learner, and the learner's in the other room, and the learner's part of the experiment. Like, the learner knows what's going on. The teacher is giving the learner questions. So the person's in the other room, right? Teacher's giving them questions. If the learner answers wrong, the teacher is directed by the scientist to give that person a shock. And then the shocks increase over a course of time. And the shocking outcome is that a lot of people, they are willing to inflict harm on others once given direction by an authority figure. Well, there's been some problems and issues with these studies, and I think they're important to talk about because these ideas reinforce some inadequate views of human behavior, and they reinforce the sort of idea that humans are willing to do things, willing to harm other people. Like, that's a tendency that we have, or people will do when left to their own devices, that they're a guard, that they will start inflicting harm on others. It's much more complicated than that. And these studies have had a problem in terms of both replication, as well as even going back when they're originally done. There was problems with the experimental design, problem with both Milgram and Zimbardo and how they got involved with their setting up the experiment. And so I'm going to kind of talk about that a little bit. You can read this over. I won't go over it too much, but basically just saying, hey, there's things that are going on within that experiment. Like, one of the moments in the experiment that was on audio tape is one of the persons saying, basically screaming, "I got to get out of here. I got to get out of here." And then they go back later on, interview him, years and years later. And he says, basically, I was saying that in order to get out of the experiment, because I had a graduate records exam to get into grad school. I had to study for that. I had to devote myself to my studies. And the only way out of this experiment that Zimbardo was going to let me out is if I started screaming and basically saying, I can't handle it anymore. This is too much for me. So Zimbardo oftentimes reported the story that this environment created this kind of real pathological behavior. But the reality is that this person fabricated or was saying these kind of things just to get out of the experiment. There's those kind of issues that come up that bring into question the validity of those studies. They're provocative. They lead us to some good questions, but we need to be also critical of the research itself. This is a powerful book. It's one of my more enjoyable reads over the last few years. Written by Bregman, called Humankind, A Hopeful History. And what he talks about is this sort of, thinking about human behavior and thinking about what does it mean to be human, right? And the different ways that we think about it. So we have one way of thinking about it is this kind of the Lord of the Flies, survival of the fittest. Humans are these kind of selfish creatures that, if left to their own devices, they will seek advantage and they will do anything to gain advantage over others, right? So they turn into kind of this animal that's a very harmful animal. Well, the reality is that Bregman kind of works with is that humans are much more cooperative than that. Can humans do bad things? Absolutely. Can humans harm others? Absolutely. But humans and the human experience is much more rooted in cooperation. But we tell the story of kind of the bad human. We tell that story, like Lord of the Flies, that fictional account. Golding came up, his biography is interesting. He grew up in a family that was pretty authoritarian, had a lot of struggles in his own life. I think his father had alcohol-related problems, abusive. All these different kind of things. That's part of his biography, and I think it comes through in his writing. That story resonates in culture. The reality is that there's this story. There's this cool story of 6 kids shipwrecked. They stayed for 15 months there on this island. They finally got rescued And when the boat came in to rescue them, the 15 kids were together as a unit. They survived by cooperation. I mean, that's the real story. But we often tell this other story about sort of this dark side of human condition. There can be a dark aspect to who we are, but who we are is much more complicated than these kind of versions or Stanford and Milgram kind of point and indicate. And I just wanted to make sure that we're kind of aware of that kind of piece, that to kind of fill up or finish up with sort of group and why the center is group is that there's a tendency to conform to group. It's a natural human tendency. Think about how do we create structures and institutions that facilitate pro-social behavior is a valuable thing. And our desire to belong to the group is very pro-social. There's value in that. Cooperation is a valuable kind of component. And we need to be wary of these stories that we tell within culture about who humans are. And to the idea if humans are inherently selfish and inherently kind of bad, then where that leads us to is then it justifies social policies and other responses to control and regulate, groups and members of society itself in ways that are much more harsh than need to be. So we got to be more mindful of how we create structures and institutions. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. So the second topic is thinking about this interesting idea of Mcdonaldization. We can talk about cultural diffusion we talked about before, right? Where culture gets diffused, it goes across, regional, it goes across geographic boundaries. So Starbucks gets diffused, right? Cultural leveling, things become more alike. Cultural imperialism, sort of a more critical view that products from dominant countries, they take over, they colonize other countries. It's very imperialistic. So these Starbucks goes to the Middle East, goes to Africa, goes to South America. They're imperializing, they're bringing their values and their ideals and, commodification and consumerism and all these different kind of things that go along with that. So it becomes like this extension of colonization. So Mcdonaldization is this idea that comes from George Ritzer, but Ritzer's really drawing from Max Weber. And Max Weber is our sociologist who is more on the interpretive side of things, symbolic interactionism, but also spent a lot of time on rationality and bureaucracy. And Weber was interested in transition to modernity, to modern social life, and how we become increasingly developed systems of rationality, or that are built on rationality, and that the world becomes more bureaucratic. And there's both need and value and benefit in that, and then there's consequences to that. So there's the two edges to that sword. Weber talked about the iron cage of rationality, that we get more and more rational, it becomes a cage that traps us. And then when we get trapped by that, we put more rationality on top of that, which even entraps us further. Think about artificial intelligence, right? And how that's being used today in ways that are more confining, restricting, but also at the same time, maybe providing protection and security. But it's a sort of idea of rationality that Weber's after. The Mcdonaldization, the idea Ritzer says basically develops is that more and more of our institutions and social life are becoming McDonaldized. And McDonald's, of course, a fast food restaurant, but those principles of fast food, which you could even go back to Henry Ford, and the development of the Model T and the mass production of automobiles, right? Scientific management is what we call it, or Taylorism. That the development of a mass production is built on certain principles. Mcdonaldization is built on 4 principles. It's built on efficiency, becoming more efficient, more predictable, so the same. So you can go anywhere and get the same Starbucks experience, right? It's from architecture and layout and design of the store to the products inside. So it's efficient, it's predictable, it's calculability, and what that means is that it's the bigger the better, or the quantity over quality. And that becomes part of things become McDonaldized, right? So we get bigger bang for the buck. So more quantity versus quality. And the last part is control through automation. So more and more stuff gets automated, right? So you go to McCafe, it's automated now. Now you go there within some stores, right? You're the one who actually, you don't need the cashier anymore. You're actually placing the order and getting your order somewhere, down the line without actually having to interact with another human. There's dramaturgy in this. So going back to Goffman's idea that life is a performance, right? So theatrical performance, there's a stage. You think about Starbucks, right? And through this lens of dramaturgy, the layout of the building, you walk into a Starbucks, the impression that's being managed, impression management, dramaturgy, right? The impression of a certain class and appearance in terms of coffee, the ways in which people are dressed as far as the staff are dressed, their greetings, how they greet you, the language of the coffee itself, the size of the cups. I mean, all that stuff is dramaturgy. Interesting kind of example of that. And from Ritzer's viewpoint, there's a relationship between consumers, capital, and culture. Part of this Mcdonaldization is that we come to demand it. Consumers come to demand it. You could say they get trained into that, or they see the value in that. They want something that's either predictable or efficient. It fits their lifestyle or their need at that particular moment. So part of it, we drive that, but part of it, capital is driving that, right? So that it's more profitable. So it's about profit, right? It's about increasing profit, getting greater market share, like that's the goal. So that's another component. And it's also an expression of culture. I've traveled to different countries around the world, and it's very common in a lot of countries to, like you go downtown in a community and never see a franchise. They're all local owned stores, bread store. You go to your dessert store. It's not this big box store kind of model. That was very American, and then it became kind of diffused as a model in more and more countries around the world. It gets to be culturally leveling when you travel around the world now. Now it's more common to see Starbucks where you go, right? Or these kind of things. And some people would say it's imperialistic, that it's actually dominating those countries and creating a loss of culture within them. The other concept here is emotional labor. So working at any organization that has these principles of Mcdonaldization, it's emotional labor, right? So you get a script as an employee where you have to follow. You work in telemarketing, there's a script that you have to follow. Your call time is being managed, identified. There's a lot of emotional labor of putting up this front, impression management, putting up this front to customers. That's exhausting. It's emotional labor. And I think it's kind of a cool, interesting concept to think about. And excuse me, then Karl Marx had this idea about alienation of labor, that it's kind of a statement that the further and further we get distance from the producer and the consumer, it creates greater alienation. So McDonald's, we don't even know where any of that food comes from. We don't even know, the buyer, the buyer of that food, there's just so much distance, right? There's a lot of alienation. The worker is alienated from the labor being involved in terms of what was being produced. So they're just a step in the process, right? So from that viewpoint, from Marx's viewpoint, regardless if it's more efficient or predictable, it's very alienating and dehumanizing. This is a hat I bought in Cuba years ago when traveling there with a friend of mine. And you notice there's no logos. This is a handmade straw hat, bought it from someone in a shop. This is non-alienated labor. The person probably directly bought the material to make this hat from someone locally in that community. They sold this hat to me, so I got a direct connection to the producer. So non-alienated kind of work. Charlie Chaplin's Modern Time, great little video just sort of this modern time. We're developing this sort of rational world. And Charlie Chaplin in this film kind of looking at the sort of modernity, Henry Ford and the assembly line. We're not going to show this right now, but this is a real short video on, man, in warehouses today, it is incredible the ability to move things in a warehouse. Powerful. What I demonstrate here, we're trying to get at here is this is Rain Shadow Organics. It's a local community farm, supplies produce here locally in the community to restaurants and consumers. Non-alienated, non-McDonaldized, or very, very little bit in terms of Mcdonaldization. I mean, they still have to be efficient and predictable, right? But it's a whole different goal, different model. Then we go to things that are much more, mechanized. Just think about the ways in terms of poultry is produced or cattle's being, that beef is being produced. I mean, there's a lot of McDonaldization to that kind of stuff. These are eggs that are come from a local market, so less McDonaldized, and actually see a lot of variability in terms of colors, sizes, and shape. This is what consumers come to demand: is the uniform conformity, same size, same shape, clean, no chicken poop, man, no bird feathers, right? That's something we come to demand in a way. Even trash. I mean, when I was a kid growing up, I mean, you had trash collectors that actually come by, grab your bin, throw it in there. They'd ride on the back here, go door to door. Think about now. It's like you have the person doesn't have to get out. It's mechanized. There's actually a video camera here to see what comes out. So in case you put glass in there, when glass shouldn't be in there, they can identify that, and you get, of course, get charged for that. But because you're tainting their product that they need to sell. So there's a reason for that. Here's in India, I think this was India, so less developed model. We can think about McDonaldization in different ways too. Think about what we see. Again, you can click on this video to look at basically enhancement, digital enhancement. And what we see, there's a lot of McDonaldization stuff. If you can look at photoshopping, right? Of creating this kind of image of who we want people to be or to represent. We could see, that in terms of photoshopping. We could look at McDonaldization of our teeth, McDonaldization of our personal appearance. If you look at American teeth versus British teeth, kind of interesting. The Brits are less fascinated by straight white teeth. You see that if you ever watch films or TV shows from Britain. Some of them, that are meant for a more just sort of Western European audience, have normal people in terms of, or I should say normal people, have much more variability in terms of presentation of self regarding teeth. And this isn't just sort of about globalization. Think about just the ways in which, McDonaldization has led to development of big transnational corporations that have the ability to move product around the world. So on the one side, with efficiency and predictability, is that it's greater production and greater ability for consumers to engage in that and maybe find value and benefit from that. On the downside of that, it leads to more consumerism, which has environmental consequences and social consequences. And it could be things like imperialism and things like that as well. We'll talk about this as class, but think about different examples and illustrations of McDonaldization. Give you an example of the iron cage of rationality. That Richard says that things get more and more McDonaldized or more rational, enters more and more institutions. So even churches, you can think about religious institutions as being McDonaldized, from the architecture all the way down into the sermon from the minister, from the leader of the congregation. This is a picture of the development of suburbia. Suburbia is McDonaldization of housing. And we can see that if you look at Central Oregon, look at Madras, look at Redmond, look at Bend, Prineville, La Pine, wherever it may be. You can see through the history of time, right? Look at it. Things that were built prior to the 1970s were much more variability. You look at housing developments today, and you just see that uniformity, predictability. Well, you get bigger houses for cheaper costs. That's on the one side, but things become more homogenous. They become this appearance of appearance of authenticity or diversity, but it's really all kind of very similar. Weber also had this idea that the world becomes disenchanted. The more we become focused on rationality, that we lose a sense of connection to the spiritual aspects of spiritual aspects of the social, material, and natural world. And I think a good example of this, if you look at architecture, this is in Barcelona. We were here a few years ago. This is a beautiful cathedral. Look how it took 2.5 centuries to build this cathedral. It was the tallest building by far in Barcelona at that time. It's awe-inspiring, right? It's spiritual in nature. This building here was constructed in 6 years. I mean, it's just like, that is mind-blowing. So this is Dubai, and this is the world's tallest structure. 6 years they built this thing. It dwarfs this thing. I bet you this be maybe right here, be my guess, somewhere. And not even that, it's probably like way down here. This was built in 6 years. I mean, it's powerful. This is symbolic. You just look at that, you can just see this idea of rationality, science, technology, engineering. There's engineering and science and technology involved in this too, but not nearly the degree to which that is there. Okay, so now let's kind of shift and move into deviance. Okay, so now our third topic, thinking about, okay, what is the sociological perspective on deviance? So deviance is basically a violation of a social norm. So that's how you can define it, but man, it gets tricky because the question is, well, who's deciding what is a norm? Doesn't the norm depend on what group you belong to? Do norms change based on social location and your social position? So the definition is straightforward, but it's really complicated to try to break it down. So we'll kind of get into some of those kind of aspects of some of the challenges of thinking about deviance. So we think about deviance, we think about the violation of a norm, and norms are expectations. That gets us right into the social world. So when we put a judgment on something, it gets us into that place of thinking, well, who's making the judgment and why? What are the consequences of being identified as someone as being deviant? We think about the labeling, being labeled in terms of being deviant as well. So when we address something as bad, we got to get into culture, history, relationships of power between different groups. We have to get into all different kind of things like that. In our class, the Zoom class, we'll get into, I'll provide a handout, what is deviant, just kind of promote some thought and discussion about ideas of deviance. Here's an example. I think it's something that we see today as being, sexual assault, regardless if it's in a marriage or without a marriage, within a committed marital relationship, it doesn't matter. It's still sexual assault. I mean, that's the law today. If you go back before 1978, in the case of Oregon versus Rideout, this was the first court case that established that a person could not be protected by being within a marriage from charges of sexual assault. So before 1978, before this case, and even after that, it took states a while to adopt laws and criminal sanctions against individuals who sexually assaulted their spouse. That's 1978. That's 44 years ago, right? So what we see as deviant today wasn't always so. Deviance isn't always what is harmful. Deviance and criminality aren't necessarily the same. So those are kind of some of the things that we'll get into. Martin Luther King. We recognize him today as an important and a valuable leader who shaped American history in important and valuable ways. At the time period, in 1950s, I mean, he was viewed as being a communist by many, an agitator, a troublemaker, a liar, especially within, of course, the white community and certain members of the white community. It wasn't until the 1980s that there was a move towards having Martin Luther King Day, a recognized federal holiday. And that was not easy to get that recognized as a national holiday. There was a lot of resistance to the identification of Martin Luther King as a national holiday. So there's all kinds of different things about that. So somewhat, there's some discomfort maybe with a discussion about sociology of deviance. And the discomfort maybe is not the right word, but some pushback or some reaction to investigating things more analytically, objectively, and kind of stepping back, not placing our own value judgment, but trying to understand. Our focus is not on the individual, but on patterns. We're looking at the general and the particular, right? So if I'm looking at sexual assault, looking at drug use, whatever the issue may be, I'm looking at not the individual, we're looking at patterns. And that's important because we need to move away from this idea of bad individuals, because that removes any context. So we have to put humans in a context. We have to put groups in a context. Historical context, cultural context, social context, like all that stuff is important to be able to examine to better understand the human experience. We are more prone to going down that bad individual kind of route and saying, person did something, they're a bad individual. Well, yeah, their action, people need to be regulated for stepping outside the boundaries. I mean, criminal sanctions are important. We need to reinforce them. They're important for making sure that we have safety and security in our community. So it's not an argument against any of that. But to claim only the bad individual removes from examination the social context. And we do that, I think we do that because it fits our cultural values of rugged individualism. But I think that idea of the bad individual and going to that space without introducing the cultural and historical and political context only serves to maintain particular inequalities. Those policies aren't helpful in promoting things that are greater for the social good. Human, perhaps, I put this last point here, perhaps are conditioned in ways to divide us and them on moral positions. And we have difficulty understanding that expressions of deviant and criminal behavior are always about interaction between individuals and social forces, and the non-deviant and the non-deviant. So what I mean here is that there's a relationship between the deviant and the non-deviant, the criminal, the person who commits crime, and those who do not. Part of the relationship is, the ways in which the non-deviant, the non-criminal, imposes their will, their ways of thinking on that other group. Part of it is the criminal or the deviant, their actions as well. So there's a relationship going on between the two. All right. Okay, so sorry, I just kind of take a stop there for a second. I'm going to bypass this. This video is going to be a lot longer than I anticipated, so I'm going to bypass this one. But basically, just saying there's a difference between the objective level of harm and subjective or perceived level of harm. A sociology of deviance gets us into thinking about the act. So what's being defined as being deviant? So we have to get into addressing the meanings. So thinking about sexual assault, for example. Right? So is culture and how are people defining something? So that gets us into history, culture, time period. So why 1978, where sexual assault becomes recognized as a criminal act? Part of that has to do with the feminist movement in the 1970s and other things that are going on in historical and cultural context. Is taking the life of another person deviant or criminal? Well, here's an image of lynching in the South. Lynchings were fairly common in the South. And mob justice in this sort of way was not viewed as being deviant or criminal. It was institutionalized. The act, just because it's harmful, doesn't necessarily make it deviant or criminal. And also that it doesn't need to be voluntary in order to be deviant as well. A person can be born with a deformity and be viewed as being deviant. So it's not even about voluntary kind of will. Deviance is something that is a meaning assigned to individuals. Here's some examples of the act. Okay, so smoking, increasing the age of smoking to age 21. Go back to 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, smoking was not deviant. So now it's both deviant and there's a criminal aspect to it in terms of buying tobacco before a certain age. A few years ago, smoking in the state of Oregon, smoking, vaping in a car with a child present has become a criminal sanction for that as well. It's interesting, right? Okay, how do we think about the act? Things become made criminal and deviant. So we're trying to understand that process of making something criminal or deviant. Then we get into the actor. So part of it, we got to understand the act, the context around it, the meaning associated with it, separating the objective from the subjective level of harm. Then we get into the actor. Part of whether something is deviant or the extent to which it's deviant or criminal depends on who the actor is. So gender, race, class makes a difference. The insurgency in January of 2021 at the nation's capital, looking at versus compared to Black Lives Matter and protests of Black Lives Matter, how we view these two different events has a lot to do with the status of the individuals that are there, both race in terms of race, class, gender, those components. Beer bonging on college campuses. I mean, it's, these things, the actor is important, right? So the same behavior could be engaged in by two different people, but the two different people could be individuals of a different class, race, or gender, and there could be a different sanction based on who they are. This is a good example of this. I think like cussing and swearing is an interesting thing, that females who swear are sanctioned more heavily than males who swear. So they can say the same words, right? But who the actor is makes a difference. Brock Turner years ago for sexually assaulting a woman on college campus, and you can read this sort of excerpt here. But basically, I think, class was at play, race was at play in terms of the sanction that he received. Who the actor is makes a difference. It can make a difference. The third part of thinking about deviance, thinking about the setting. So thinking about the setting where something occurs. So this guy was arrested for smoking a joint in a Tennessee court. During his court session, I can't remember what he was there for. He took out a joint, lit it up. Of course, he's going to be arrested for that. Context is everything, right? So the setting. So something may be appropriate in one setting, but not in another. Drinking behavior at a funeral versus at a wedding. And then the fourth element is the audience response. So deviance happens when there's an audience response. Deviance is not present if there's not an audience response. Okay, so deviance implies that there's going to be some sanction or some stigma, some reaction from the community to whatever it is. So deviance requires an audience response. And those responses can be ranged from the micro level, individuals that we know, our social group, all the way to the macro level, institutions. They can be informal, stigma, reaction, shuns, labeling people as being deviant, or all the way to formal sanctions in terms of social control. The response is required for deviance to exist. If I did something deviant and no one knew, or my social group knew, but no one else outside that social group knew, and I'm not being identified as deviant, then it's not really deviant, right? It requires a social sanction is the question. Okay, now we'll kind of get into some theories. I'll probably go through these a little bit faster, or I'm not going to go through all of them, but maybe hit a few of them. Okay, so the first one here is, excuse me, is called the social disorganization theory. And this is sociology's first major theory of looking at crime. And I think you could look at this theory, it really moved us towards empathizing, and empathizing not meaning soft emotional, empathizing meaning understanding. Understanding at a cognitive level, analytical level, empirical level, of understanding some of the underlying forces that are shaping crime patterns. So the focus of social disorganization theory was understanding how communities are organized. And communities that are organized in terms of people have belonging, connection, there's community resources, community organizations, civic organizations like church, churches or religious institutions, after school programs, education, workforce, all these different public parks and institutions. I mean, if there's community and people have a sense of belonging, it's organized as a community, crime rates are relatively low. Where you find crime much more prominent are in communities where there's a lot more disorganization. And this is a chart from some of the early work, and basically just kind of go, it's this zone here in zone 2, zone of transition, people moving in and out, people aren't longtime owners of homes or apartments. So you have turnover in the community, people don't have the belonging and connection. It's much more in turmoil, there's less there's less civic organizations in the community. Crime is going to be much more common in that area. So we look at places that post-industrialism means started in the 1970s, we moved to a different economy. So let's say from, I don't know, let's just say from the 1800s all the way till 1970, we lived in more of a manufacturing and agricultural based society. 1970s, our manufacturing basically really declined, started to decline. I mean, globalization happened. So places where there was a lot of manufacturing, jobs left, or businesses left, manufacturing hubs left, people in those communities no longer had employment, access to employment. Really, it was detrimental to those communities. Those people who could leave and had the resources to leave left, leaving behind even more challenges in that community. And this is a community, these are communities that have been socially disorganized. So we think about Baltimore, Detroit, certain parts of Chicago. Think about Ferguson when think about Michael Brown, if you're aware of Michael Brown and the incident that happened in Ferguson. Ferguson is a community socially disorganized. And there's a lot of context around that disorganization itself. And it's understanding that disorganization is an important part of understanding the likelihood of certain types of crime. So anomie is that normlessness, right? So a lot of sudden change, a lot of lack of direction, a lack of anchors creates an environment where criminality is more likely to happen. Focuses on the structural side, not the individual side. These are a couple different videos. Just for the sake of time, I'm not going to show them. You can watch them. Basically about Baltimore, and I like this video here because she's a resident, young woman, resident of Baltimore, talking about that Baltimore is not all bad, right? That there's a lot of good things that are going on in Baltimore, that we have this sort of viewpoint that maybe that's supported by what the stories that we hear about Baltimore. People are trying to create community, but they're running up against some serious challenges within that community. But it's kind of interesting, right? Just there's both a lot of disorganization and this desire to form community, but they need help in shaping and developing that community. We could look at different places in terms of violent crime, Baltimore, Maryland in general, the national rate, like something's going on, right? So we're looking at patterns, moving away from the bad individual to looking at the social context. Closer to home, and this is a really good short little interview with Christoph and Wadoon talking about their work Tightrope. It's about Oregon City. It's an interesting book. It's pretty depressing, but it's I think a great example of social disorganization theory. And basically, for Oregon City, he grew up in that. Christoph grew up in that community back in probably the 1950s, 60s, 70s. There was manufacturing there, and there was the mill there. So there was an employment sector there. The community was, I mean, it wasn't that there's no problems in the community. But the level of problems and the level of crime are relatively low. There was opportunity. People had a belonging and connection. People had responsibility to the community. Starting with the movement of manufacturing away, the mill shutting down, people who could leave left. It became a community much more impoverished, a lack of civic organizations and institutions, a lack of social support. And that community, he goes back and writes about it, that his high school friends that stay behind. The drug use rates are relatively high, very depressing in terms of health impacts, in terms of people. And I think it's a great example locally within our state of looking at communities that transition to a post-industrial economy. Not every community survived well with that. Central Oregon and Bend, right? We transformed from the old mill to the old mill consumerism, and promoting tourism as being an industry. So we have economic vitality, right? We're much more organized in terms of a community. Well, I mean, we have crime. It's not that we don't have crime, right? But you could look at where our crime patterns are for violent crime. They're going to be in certain areas of the community, and it's in those areas that are going to be more predominantly more disorganized. So that's kind of an application there. Okay, then we kind of get into labeling theory, and labeling theory gets at this idea that nothing is inherently deviant. It's only deviant if we label it as deviant. Labels vary in degree, right? Stigma. It could be very light, or it could be really heavy in terms of stigma. So stigma is that basically that negative judgment reaction, labels that demonstrate, how, it's a moral judgment. You can look at, our ideas of Cooley and Mead, right, in terms of self-development. So looking glass self. So if I serve time in prison, I'm an ex-convict. That language of ex-convict is going to play. It's going to intervene or be an influence in terms of my looking glass self. We're thinking about Mead and self-development, thinking about taking the role of other. How do I imagine other people seeing me in terms of that status? And then there's dramaturgy with stuff too, right? Is that if I had been, for example, an ex-convict, there's dramaturgy in terms of trying to manage my impression with others. So maybe I don't reveal my past because I'm aware of what that past may mean to other people. So there's some dramaturgical parts of that. The labels that we have also tie into the superior wharf hypothesis, right? Language, we view the world through the lens of language. Language and culture are interactive. So words such as ex-convict, a drug addict, a junkie, welfare queen, somebody who's homeless, or just say, the homeless, all these different kind of things, right? All those languages, all those are language, and language has values that are embedded within them, and we see the world through that lens of language. That's why it's important to become more humanizing, I would argue, in terms of the language that we use. So Brian Stevenson, who wrote a book called, what was it called? Just Mercy. It's got a great TED Talk I maybe made reference to before, talking about injustices within the criminal justice system. And he's a very compassionate individual who advocates. He provides this perspective that we are more than the worst thing that we've ever done. That even somebody who commits murder is more than a murderer. Somebody who steals is more than a stealer. He says even a nation who enslaved people is more than a slave nation. And I think it's really powerful, right? Because it's that master status that goes along with, somebody who commit murder, that we see them, they're only a murderer. They'll always be a murderer, like in the eyes of society. And you think about things like as rehabilitation and reintegration, like that's going to be a barrier for reintegration. It's not arguing that there shouldn't be some sense of control and regulation and response to people's actions. And this is, if I were to go back, this is what I mentioned before of why some of this stuff may be difficult to kind of get into, is because we may have discomfort in going there, right? I think we've been socialized and conditioned in certain ways to not engage in that humanizing aspect of who other people are and look at things more analytically from a more detached, objective viewpoint. Labels are powerful. Labels are a reflection of, sometimes the labeling is more about the dominant group or the non-deviant, non-criminal group than it is about the group being labeled. I mean, there's that issue going on, right? Then you get into like certain theories under labeling theory, Leamert's theory of societal reaction perspective. Basically, primary deviance that occurs before being labeled. Secondary deviance is after a person's been identified as being deviant by group or by society. It's that impact of the label. So if a juvenile who's committed offense, now they become a juvenile offender. So what's the impact of that label on that particular individual? And just how other people see them, how they see themselves, all that different kind of stuff. And then there's third level deviance as well. So kind of what does a person do after that? So that third level of deviance. There's deviance disavowal. So distancing oneself from the deviant label. So there's different aspects in sort of thinking about labeling. This is one example I came up with, I'll just provide here. For a while there, maybe, 1990s, there are different ordinances in different cities about baggy pants and actual criminal sanctions there were misdemeanors about wearing baggy pants. And there's stuff, right? It's like labeling, identifying, it's like raising questions. What are we labeling, identifying as being deviant or criminal? Thinking about sexual orientation, the march for gay rights with Stonewall in 1969, starting the gay rights, local, the modern day gay rights movement in the United States. The the pushing back against being identified as being deviant. And it takes a long time to make change, right? We are now at that place now where same-sex marriages and relationships are much more accepted, and there are now constitutional protections in terms of same-sex marriage. And even within within the Mormon community, recent commencement address, proud to be a gay son of God. So a gay, the commencement speaker is gay, and identifying himself as being gay at his commencement speech. I mean, that's pretty powerful change in culture, right? So that stigma has decreased. Doesn't mean it's not there at all, but it's moved and changed. These are just a couple charts on the degree to which same-sex marriage has increased and opposition decreased. And this is interesting to look at it across political party lines. Interesting to look at 2004, Republicans are about where they are, where Democrats were 16 years ago in terms of allowability, acceptance of same-sex marriage. We could look at labeling theory and impact if we look at things such as something like suicide among individuals who are transgender. Powerful, right? Societal reaction perspective, being stigmatized, excluded, marginalized by dominant culture and by social groups can lead to mental health consequences and lead to influence or shape the degrees in which things like suicide might happen. The language that we use, for example, this is the example of 1980s, during the crack scare of the 1980s, that Hillary Clinton, Bob Dole from the Republican Party, Hillary Clinton from Democratic Party, there was this sort of move to calling individuals in predominantly Black and brown kids from the inner city who engaged in criminal behavior or perceived, or at least allegations that they engaged in it, didn't matter if they did or not. This idea of they were super predators. They were just so bad to the core. And that's like, I mean, we look at that now, step back from that and go like, that is incredibly powerful, that language that was being used at that particular time period. This is why labeling theory and why sociology, I think that perspective of questioning the labels that are being used, thinking about the historical, social, cultural, political context, who's gaining from these labels, this identification. And it's so dehumanizing and harmful, those labels. We need to kind of make sure we're more mindful of what's going on in the social world. Another application of the labeling theory is medicalization of deviance, is that more and more basically of social life is being identified by experts, so we're medicalizing more and more of social life. So basically the idea is that psychiatry, other institutions, we're medicalizing more and more of our social life. So things become viewed as a pathology. And there became pushback against that in the 1970s. The anti-psychiatry movement of the 1970s is to question some of the stuff that was going on about labeling things as being psychiatric or pathological. So medicalization, we're medicalizing, this is trepanation, the belief that people who were insane, there was something on, they couldn't see this, this is before modern science. So they just believed that there was something going on in the human skull, trepanation, drilling a hole through the human skull to let out the evil spirits. So the view that it was sort of evil spirits. The rise in science and development, Cesar Lombroso, the criminal man, the sort of idea that criminality is tied to pathology of the genetic self. So biological determinism in terms of criminal behavior. Psychiatric stuff led to sort of all kinds of different kind of things, these different kind of treatments that Benjamin Rush and others were putting forward. This idea of trying to control and regulate and deal with things that are being identified as being insane and insanity. Part of the this is Salem Hospital in Salem, Oregon. This is part of the anti-psychiatry movement. Ken Kesey was one of many who was really critiqued what was going on within mental institutions in the 1950s and 60s, and writing about it, bringing to public awareness some of the issues going on in terms of treatment of people who were in these hospitals. So yeah, I mean, this is just kind of a comical kind of aspect of thinking about this belief, like medicalizing more and more social life. So there's a belief that we could look at the bio, we couldn't see yet into neurologically. So the shape of the human skull became something that would be looked at to be able to identify what's going on in terms of personality or features or characteristics of who a person is. And I've stumbled across this one a while ago. I just thought it was so funny. Genuine husband, unreliable husband, sort of features, the shape of the head, the shape of the skull is sort of an indication of that. More stuff on medicalization, thinking about things of medicalizing something such as people who don't conform to the dominant cultural ideas of gender, labeling it gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder. And so it raises questions about, about definition, who's defining what's deviant, who's defining what's not, what lens are we defining if we do define it as being deviant. What is the lens we're defining it? In some ways, psychiatric identifications can be helpful at the same time. If there's something going on, for example, somebody with schizophrenia, a serious and persistent mental illness, the diagnosis can be a good use of science in order to be able to understand, to be able to offer treatment and to be able to offer guidance and direction. But we have to be kind of very mindful of, is the institution of psychiatry taking on more and more things that are really not psychiatric en route, but social en route? And what are the consequences of labeling? From the 1950s, 1960s, all the way to 1973, homosexuality was identified as a mental illness. And then in 1973 removed. So kind of, some kind of problem with, we could look back historically that psychiatric illnesses, there's been some issues with them. Here's another one, drapetomania. Basically, the idea that was being advanced in the 1800s is that slaves who ran away from their slave owner they must have mania, they must be crazy, they must be mad, instead of being diagnosed with drapetomania, this condition. And then there's the anti-psychiatry movement. You can watch this cool short little video about Rosenhan's study of being sane in insane places, of him trying to basically identify and bringing into light that there's a lot of subjectivity going on within the psychiatric community. They're not as pure as they think, and we should question and be a guard with, to not give too much power to the psychiatric community. And then I'd like to end with this too, to realize also that, that people do experience mental health challenges and issues and problems. We could look at the levels in which of certain mental health disorders in the United States or across the globe. And I would encourage us to think about not only the individual and to blame the individual, but look about individuals within context. So let's look at social structures and conditions and think about how we respond and how we label and identify. Think about looking glass self, think about all kinds of different things going on, cultural values. There's an interesting article I read recently from the Sun magazine about the psychiatrist by trade talking about from psychiatry and medicalization, modernity to post-modernity. And it kind of you can kind of read through this, but it's interesting to say that some of their research is that depression is a human response, that going into more indigenous communities and giving them surveys about their mental health state, that depression exists. It's not only a modern day condition. So depression is it's a human experience. It can be problematic. It can be challenging. It can create disruptions in one's life. So the question isn't whether or not, I think it's the meaning that we assign to depression, how we think about it, how we decide to approach addressing depression is important too. So kind of fits in this idea of labeling and how we understand things. The United States is the only country, the United States and New Zealand are the only two countries that allow for direct consumer advertising for pharmaceuticals. So we see a lot of pharmaceutical ads shaping our ideas of mental health and of psychiatric conditions. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder, a disorder that was created a few years ago, established a few years ago, and there was all kinds of questions going on. Is it really real? Is this the psychiatric community gone too far? The pharmaceutical community generating conditions in order to be able to sell a product? Thinking about things like alternatives, right? Psilocybin is gaining sort of recognition about hallucinogenics or about God, I can't even think of the thing. So yeah, thinking about drugs that sort of psychedelic experiences, right? So thinking about alternatives, right? So part of our approach before has been trust in sort of science and technology and pharmaceuticals. Now that we're moving in a little bit different direction about certain things as well. I just want to bring up everyone's attention that there's resources here in our community as well at COCC in terms of personal counseling. So to be aware of what those resources are to you. And if you ever need resources, rely on people. I mean, that's what resources are there for. I don't know, let's kind of leave with sort of conflict theory and maybe functionalism. So conflict theory application to deviance is basically looking at the issue of power, deviance and criminality as power and control. So the laws that we have and the ways in which we approach establishing and reinforcing the laws, that we have to be mindful and aware of the ways that class and race and gender and other aspects focus, are shaping the law and institutions that reinforce the law, ranging from the courts all the way down to law enforcement carrying out the law itself. And to be wary of not identifying bad actors within those institutions, but looking at it more at a macro level, both cultural, institutional level versus the bad individual level. So we focus a lot in the United States on retribution versus rehabilitation. That's maybe for cultural reasons, but that's also about maintaining inequality as well. Powerful film called The 13th. If you haven't seen it before, it's about basically the 13th Amendment, and it's a real powerful film. We had this sort of thing about a particular theory of crime, this broken windows theory that's been proven to be, even the researchers who designed broken windows theory, that it's been proved, that it got taken in a direction they did not intend, and the direction it got taken to things like stop and frisk policies in New York, was one state where basically it was found unconstitutional, that there were race and class components to that. If you think about conflict theory, you can think about, well, how do we regulate homelessness within a community? There's issues of regulation going on there that we could identify about conflict theory. And then I'll leave it up to you. You can watch this short video about some of the other theories about that we didn't cover here, just too much to cover. This is an interesting video about Norway. I really encourage you to watch this. About Norwegian prisons and how they approach incarceration, just such a different model. And I would argue this is based more on a model of rehabilitation and a model based on science and based on metrics of what works and what does not work. Short little interview with Brian Stevenson, pretty powerful. And then finally is the functionalist perspective that deviance exists in all societies, therefore deviance must have a function. Deviance does these things. It clarifies our values of what's right and wrong, establishes boundaries to be, basically how much is acceptable, increases solidarity between those who have not and those who have, those who haven't committed deviance. And it promotes sometimes social change. Sometimes you have agitators, people who go against the grain, and it becomes sort of a way to promote social change. The problem of functionalism, it doesn't address power very well. So it does not address inequality very well. So anti-immigration efforts going back to the 1800s, early 1900s, the belief that the Chinese and that the Irish were devouring America, this anti-immigrant stance that we find raises in the United States at certain time periods. You could say, okay, well, that the immigrants are being defined as being deviant. That's drawing social solidarity. It's clarifying values, but it doesn't address that maybe the immigrants are being defined as being detrimental. That's about power. That's about power and inequality. I'm not going to go through those, just sort of another example of how an American Activities Committee, 1950s, a lot of things you can sort of look at from the functionalist perspective about that hysteria, the scapegoating, the reaction from society about fear of communism. There's a lot of stuff going on about Cold War, fears of the Cold War, and that, from a functionalist viewpoint, that something like the Red Scare of the 1950s, 1960s into the 70s was promoting solidarity, promoting, clarifying what our values were and who we were. But the problem with that, again, the limitation, it does not address the issue of inequality well. Okay, so that's a lot for today. It's probably going to be the longest video. I'm not going to guarantee that, but the longest lecture for the term. It was 2 different subject areas, but a lot of content. I appreciate all you do. Have yourself a great day. Best wishes to you. Be safe and be well.